My name is Sharon Mizota, and my presentation is called Curationist, Designing a Metadata Standard and Taxonomy for an Open Cultural Ecosystem. I completed the design of this standard and taxonomy earlier this year as a consultant for the website Curationist.org. That's CURATIONIST.org. My pronouns are she and her, and my background is in cataloging and metadata management for visual art archives. If you'd like to comment or ask questions about this presentation, please do so in the Slack channel. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking with you from the ancestral territory of the Chumash, Tongva, and Kizh peoples. Here's what we'll cover today. We'll start by talking about the website, Curationist.org, and the cultural ecosystem it seeks to create. Then we'll look at the project requirements and the discovery and research phases of the project. And finally, we'll look at a few features of the Metadata Schema and Taxonomy Guidelines that support Curationist's goal of creating an open cultural ecosystem. Curationist is a website that aggregates open access, public domain, and Creative Commons licensed images and metadata from museums, archives, and libraries. It is a project of Megahertz Foundation, a nonprofit based in Virginia, whose mission is to enrich and champion global content curation. Curationist staff augment imported metadata with the aim of providing an anti-colonialist, anti-racist, feminist, queer, accessible, and multilingual lens through which to understand, view, and participate in culture. In addition to staff contributions, community users will be able to add their own metadata to records on the site. Both Curationist staff and community users will be able to curate their own collections of items and write articles based on one or more items on the site. In this way, Curationist seeks to create a cultural ecosystem that fosters dialogue and exchange within a social justice framework. They also plan to make this augmented metadata available as linked open data. This is a screenshot of the Curationist homepage in its current beta phase. The main image is actually a slideshow that changes regularly. I should note at this point that the schema, standard, and guidelines have yet to be fully implemented on the Curationist site, so what we're talking about today is more of a conceptual roadmap than an actual implementation. To facilitate these goals, the Curationist staff knew they needed to create a comprehensive metadata schema, a content standard, and a taxonomy. I was hired to research and create these resources in collaboration with the Curationist team. The project began with a Zoom discovery workshop with key Curationist stakeholders. Here are some of the takeaways. The audience for Curationist is mostly millennial and Gen Z people interested in using cultural heritage images in their own research or creations. There are also some smaller cultural institutions and individual creators who might share their content on the Curationist platform in order to access a broader audience. We also talked about what kind of institutions would contribute content to the site. In the first phase, it is mostly museums with online, public domain, or Creative Commons licensed images and metadata that are available through an API, or Application Protocol interface. APIs allow different computer systems to share and exchange data. Curationist has created an API search tool that enables staff to search and select individual images or to import large batches of images and their metadata into the site. We also clarified requirements for the deliverables. The schema, standard, and taxonomy had to be based on resources in the public domain or licensed under Creative Commons. They also had to be able to accommodate multiple layers of metadata from different sources. These included source institutions, Curationist staff, and community users. And they had to facilitate content in multiple languages and use everyday, not specialized language. In the case of the taxonomy, Curationist staff wanted to use Wikidata as a controlled vocabulary because it reflects the language currently used on the web better than older vocabularies, and it is constantly updated. For those who don't know, Wikidata contains the authority records for all Wikimedia projects. After the discovery workshop, I embarked on the research phase of the project. For the schema and content standard, my research approach was to survey the data offered by a number of source institution APIs in order to find commonalities. I looked at the documentation for about 12 different APIs. Once I had an idea of the types of data available, I evaluated existing schemas to determine the best fit for Curationist. My first thought was Dublin Core, because it is so widely used. However, museum data varies quite a bit, and it didn't fit easily into the DC field set. Curationist staff also wanted to describe items at a higher level of detail than the DC schema provides. This became evident particularly in the agent or creator field when there were multiple creators associated with an item. They wanted to be able to specify the role, extent, and importance of each creator. I'll talk about this in more detail a little bit later. Because of these requirements and the image-centric nature of the site, I next looked at the Getty's categories for the description of works of art, or CDWA, and the Visual Resources Association's VRA Core 4. Both allowed for the nuances the Curationist team were looking for. VRA Core had the added advantage of specific sub-elements that facilitated multilingual entries and tracking of sources. We'll also discuss this in more detail in a minute. For the taxonomy, although I was very familiar with common vocabularies for image collections, like the Library of Congress's Thesaurus for Graphic Materials and Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus, I had never used Wikidata before, so part of my research was learning how to use Wikidata and exploring how it could support Curationist goals of openness and social justice. So here's a very high-level overview of the metadata schema. I selected VRA Core as the base standard from which to start building. VRA Core could accommodate most of the incoming data from museums, many of whom were already using some variant of it. And it could accommodate most of Curationist's requirements. But there were a few cases where we needed to capture additional data points. So the resulting schema is a mix of VRA Core, Dublin Core, schema.org, and local fields. We used Dublin Core to fill in things like the language of the item and the provenance, which VRA Core didn't cover. Schema.org is widely used by web publishers, so it made sense to use it for metadata about the articles and more in-depth content on the site. We also use it to track usernames of Curationist and community contributors. Finally, some local fields were added for internal Curationist tracking, since this data does not need to be shared outside the organization. Here are a couple of examples of how the different schemas work together. On the left, you can see under the element agent, VRA Core includes the sub-elements role and extent, which describe that person's role in the creation of the item and the extent of their involvement. To this, I added rating value from schema.org to allow Curationist staff to indicate the order in which the data should be displayed. In this hypothetical case, Carolina Caicedo would be listed second, as she created the columns on this hypothetical building, not the building as a whole. On the right, language is a Dublin Core field that records the language of the object being described. Author comes from schema.org and records the username of the person entering the information. Source is a VRA attribute that indicates whether the data comes from a source institution, a Curationist staff member, or a community member. In this case, the metadata about the item being in Spanish comes from a community member. By mixing elements from different schemas in this way, I was able to accommodate the needs of the Curationist team, but also make the documentation and mapping processes a bit easier, as each element and sub-element is already documented in its own schema. I tried to make sure that the way in which each element was used on the Curationist site was consistent with how it's used in its own schema. Another feature of the Curationist schema is that it accommodates different sources of metadata for the same data points. There will be 3 main layers of metadata on the Curationist site. The base metadata comes from the various source institutions. This metadata is imported via API and remains unchanged. The second layer of metadata is provided by Curationist staff members. This layer might include subject terms that were not provided by the source institution, or it might provide more culturally sensitive terminology or terminology that improves discoverability. The third layer is provided by community members. These are the general site users who might provide translations or more culturally appropriate terminology that might not otherwise be included. They may also provide additional cultural context for an item that is not well documented. Here's an example of how a Curationist staff member might enhance metadata from a source institution. The source metadata is at top in black text. The Curationist provided metadata is below in green. The location metadata for this sculpture from its source, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is from Egypt. Below, a Curationist staff member has normalized this location to Egypt, which will improve discoverability for this item on the Curationist site. The source subelement indicates that this is a Curationist contribution, differentiating it from the original metadata, which is tagged as source. In this way, we preserve the original metadata from the source institution, but add a layer that enhances discoverability, allowing this item to be grouped with other items whose location is described as Egypt. Here's an example of how a community member might enhance metadata from a source institution. In this case, a community member has added an additional cultural context, indicating that this painting by African-American artist Prince Demma Barnes is not only American art, but part of African-American culture. Enhancements like this will help surface this record in searches for art by African-Americans. Finally, I wrote taxonomy guidelines for using Wikidata as a controlled vocabulary. I had created and edited taxonomies before, and I was familiar with the Wikimedia community from editing Wikipedia, but I had to learn how to use Wikidata well enough to instruct others and to design guidelines for using it for all of the controlled data on the site. Wikidata is constantly changing and evolving, so the guidelines are necessarily a living document. The nice thing about Wikidata, however, is that it assigns unique codes to every term. These numbers, which generally start with the letter Q, provide a stable identifier for a concept even if the term changes. Because, as you know, anyone can edit or create terms in Wikidata. But with the Q numbers, at least you know that the concept behind the term should remain stable, even if the term itself changes. The guidelines for basic concepts like titles and names were fairly straightforward, but because one of Curationist's goals is to provide a social justice lens on cultural content, it was important that the taxonomy guidelines reflect these values. I searched Wikidata for various terms in sensitive areas, such as culture, gender, sexual orientation, ability, race, ethnicity, and religion. Where there were multiple terms for a single concept, the guidelines indicate preferred terms and give scope notes. They also identify problematic areas, such as the terms for race and ethnicity, which on Wikidata often reflect a North American bias. Limitations like this were also noted in the guidelines. In determining preferred terms, I used Curationist's internal content guidelines, but also resources like the Conscious Style Guide, which provides language guidelines for journalists around sensitive topics. So here's an example of an entry in the guidelines for the term Latinx, which is a preferred term. As you can see, Wikidata includes several other terms with overlapping meanings: Latino, Hispanic and Latino Americans. The guidelines indicate the preferred term for Curationist staff to use, as well as specific terms that should not be used. In this case, Latinx is the preferred term because it is gender neutral and describes an American population distinct from Spanish-speaking populations in Europe or elsewhere. Here's another example where the term homeless people is preferred over homelessness, tramp, and hobo. As you can see, there are a lot of do not use terms on Wikidata, some of which are quite derogatory. In this case, homeless people was selected because it emphasizes the humanity of the subjects, not just their unhoused status. However, new, more humanizing language, such as people experiencing homelessness or people who are homeless, is emerging, so Wikidata will likely change. The taxonomy guidelines are therefore also a living document that will have to be periodically reviewed and updated as terms and their meanings evolve. Curationist's decision to integrate and promote more appropriate and respectful description, even if it means keeping an eye on a moving target like Wikidata, speaks to their commitment to create a cultural ecosystem that is open, reflective, and adaptive to all. And that's all I have for you today. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or comments, and thank you so much for your time.